After standing in line for hours along with hundreds of other residents of Buenos Aires, Maria Benitez finally has a card that lets her receive government subsidies on food purchases. But she's still not headed to the supermarket.
I don't go to the supermarket because it's unaffordable. You have to have a lot of money to shop there. Otherwise, you don't go in there.
Plagued by persistently slow economic growth, Argentina's government has defaulted on international debt repayments 8 times. That's eroded the value of the Argentinian peso, sending food and fuel prices spiraling higher. Although they've recently begun subsidizing food purchases for the most vulnerable people, officials say a lot more needs to be done.
The first objective is for everyone to eat well. The second is to create work, a lot of family farming, grassroots economy, many jobs for people who produce food and can sell it. And the third is economic development.
But launching such initiatives is difficult because the government is broke. It has to repay or restructure $100 billion in debt by the end of March. The government wants creditors to accept lower interest payments instead of the 9% initially agreed. But bondholders say they want to see reforms that can guarantee repayment before they offer any concessions. Last week, the parliament unanimously approved a host of reforms it hopes will win over international lenders.
The unsustainability of the Argentine debt is clear. Argentina has a willingness to pay, but in order to pay, the country needs to generate capacity to grow.
Officials from the International Monetary Fund arrive in Buenos Aires for talks on Wednesday. The IMF's already lent $57 billion in 2018, and it isn't scheduled to offer more loans before next year. Government officials will try to convince them to resume lending sooner, but until that happens, the economic plight of Argentinians is set to get worse. Mobin Nasir, TRT World.
Well, for more on this, Latin America analyst Colin Harding joins us now live from Manchester. Welcome to the program, Colin. Now, as we just heard there, delegates from the IMF have arrived in Buenos Aires. It's a very sensitive topic, isn't it? A potential bailout from the IMF because, of course, that organisation was widely blamed for the 2001 debt crisis that plunged almost half of Argentinians into poverty. What balance does the IMF and the Argentinian government need to strike here?
Well, a very tricky one, of course. The IMF is wildly unpopular in Argentina. And in fact, it was going back to the IMF that sealed the fate of the current government's predecessor, Mauricio Macri's conservative government, which was forced to approach the IMF eventually because it was in such an economic mess, and arrived at this total of, in fact, they still owe the IMF $44 billion. And that really ensured that they were going to lose the election to a party, the Peronists, the opposition, who were promising that they'd renegotiate Argentina's debt again, and they would end austerity, they'd get the economy growing again, and that people would not be held hostage, Argentine people would not be held hostage to international finance, as they put it. So the government, the Peronists, duly won the election, and now they're having to go back to the IMF and try and renegotiate this deal. And the government is really quite divided over how to do this between those talking tough, including the Vice President, Cristina Fernandez, and the President, who's talking about Argentina's willingness to renegotiate, to come to terms. So they're really sending out mixed messages, which the IMF will probably find quite difficult to measure.
Yes, as you say, the Peronist government was elected largely on the promise that they would end austerity measures, i.e. spending cuts, tax hikes in order to address its debt. But the IMF isn't likely to trim Argentina's debt without asking for something in return, namely those tax hikes and spending cuts. So are the two able, or do you think they'll be able to agree on some sort of a middle ground?
Well, we'll have to see. I mean, they're spending a week. They've arrived in Argentina today, and they're going to spend a week there, which is longer than was originally scheduled. So I think they're expecting to have some pretty nitty-gritty talks. It's very hard to see. The conditionality, which is always attached to IMF loans, is structural reform. It's fiscal austerity and so on, which they'd already approached the Argentine government about, the previous Argentine government. The current one, the Peronist government now, Alberto Fernandez's government, has said that they're not going to do that. The vice president, Cristina Kirchner, is talking about the IMF taking a big haircut, and it's widely believed in Argentina that the IMF was partly responsible for the present situation, because they clearly took a bet, a punt on Argentina by lending so much when there was no guarantee that Argentina would be in a position to start repaying. So they're hoping the IMF will agree that they ought to accept some of the responsibility, both take a haircut themselves and also prevail upon the private bondholders to also agree on accepting a lower repayment than is currently scheduled.
Okay, well, let's see what the two sides come up with after their meetings. Colin Harding in Manchester, thank you so much for your analysis.